Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography. Written by Chiang Meng Lin, read by Tang Daming.
Chapter 33: Characteristics of Chinese Culture. East and West are different because their cultures are different. Yet you will find similarities in both. These parallels, no matter how close, will not make two cultures alike. The peculiar characteristics of each still render one different from the other. In the West, varying culture traits make the Germans different from the English and the French from the Dutch. Yet there are characteristics common to all, common ties which hold the Western nations together culturally under the loose name of Western culture. These again differ from the Eastern nations. Similarities or contrasts of culture, therefore, are not to be judged by outward parallels, but by the fundamental character of each. In this chapter, we will examine the characteristics of Chinese culture under three headings. First, the absorbing power of Chinese civilization. Second, morals and intellect. And third, the practical wisdom of the Chinese people. (1) The absorbing power of Chinese civilization. Some 40 years ago, when I was still in school, we were constantly told by foreigners and progressive Chinese alike that China was like a solid rock which absorbs little or nothing. That is to say, Chinese civilization was stagnant and petrified, and China was incurably conservative. She loved and lived by her own ways. Nothing could effect a change in John the Chinaman. This appeared to be all right, but proved all wrong. From the opening of the treaty ports until after the Sino-Japanese War in 1894, China appeared to resist Western influence. However, during previous centuries, she had absorbed many of the outlandish things which from time to time made inroads upon her life. In music, the so-called national Chinese music of the present day is played on instruments mostly of foreign origin. Forms of the fiddle, flute, and harp were introduced from Central Asia centuries ago. We also kept the ancient Chinese harp, but only a few understand its music, and still fewer can play it. Various foods have been introduced to the Chinese dinner table from foreign lands. Watermelons, cucumbers, grapes, and peppers came hundreds of years ago. Sweet potatoes, peanuts, and Indian corn have appeared in recent centuries. In late decades, the Irish potato, tomato, cauliflower, cabbage, and lettuce have found their way into Chinese cooking. Tenderloin steaks of the West, chopped very fine and served with bean sauce, have kept delightful company with Chinese dishes. Tomato soup with tender shrimp meat and hot fried rice hissing euphoniously in it was an innovation. Dinner in China is sometimes topped off with ice cream, American coffee, and sun-kissed oranges, together with fruits of native production. Oranges grew originally in Chinese soil, traveled to America, received their education in the Luther Burbank School of California, and returned to their native land with a new title, something like the BA or PhD, brought back by Chinese students from American universities. Chinese oranges also went to Germany many years ago, where they turned into apples, for the Germans called orange Apfelsine, Chinese apple. Spiritual or intellectual nourishment from any quarter that was worth the trouble of absorbing, China was always ready to welcome. During the Ming Dynasty, the Jesuits brought to China astronomy, mathematics, and the Bible. An imperial minister was converted, and his residence in the Xujiahui district of Shanghai was made a center of Catholic activities. From the Jesuits, the Chinese learned Western astronomy and some became Christians because of it. The Xujiahui Observatory has been the guiding star for shipping along that coast ever since the opening of the treaty ports. Huang Lizhou, a great Ming scholar living during the end of the Ming and the beginning of the Qing dynasty, was one of the admirers of Western astronomy brought by the Jesuits. He said, "Learning has been preserved in foreign lands, while China has lost it owing to the lack of proper care." He once told a friend that so far as astronomy is concerned, we are only babies in comparison with the Western scholar, which shows how open-minded great Chinese scholars were. The fact is that China has endured many vicissitudes of fortune in the course of her centuries because of her great capacity for absorption. No civilization in the world could sustain itself without taking in alien elements from time to time in one way or another. I think it needs no historian to prove that point. The interdependence and mutual influences of Western civilizations are so obvious as to require no argument. But the interaction of Eastern and Western civilizations is less apparent. I have been told by Professor Joseph Needham of Cambridge that the expanding properties of gunpowder influenced the discovery of steam power, and that the idea of good in human nature of the Confucian school influenced the encyclopedists in France. A number of things have trickled from time to time into the West from the East. But I would like to leave it to the West to tell us. We did not absorb more than music, foodstuffs, and things of similar nature through our western and northern frontiers by land because there was not much more to absorb. The races in those regions had little spiritual or mental food to offer. For the latter, we turned to India. In the field of arts, Chinese painting and architecture were influenced by Buddhism. In Chinese philosophy, Buddhist thought played a very important part, and it even affected the style and vocabulary of Chinese literature. Centuries before the Jesuits, the Chinese had assimilated the moral aspects of Buddhism, but they let the system of otherworldly philosophy alone. After centuries of sojourning in China, with tens of thousands of Buddhist temples and monasteries occupying the best sites on mountains as well as in cities, its basic philosophy and religion still remain foreign to the Chinese mind. The scholars befriend or tolerate it, and the common people worship it as one of the religions in China. Nevertheless, it remains foreign. To the practical-minded Chinese, its metaphysical system is not palatable. It exists in China because there are moral teachings in it, and in time of distress, one could find moral refuge in it. The Chinese only wanted to absorb foreign elements into their own system of thought, to be enriched by them. They would not surrender their own system to an alien one. Out of their virtue of tolerance, the Chinese had an ingenious way of dealing with any system they could not absorb into their own. They would take part of it and leave the rest to coexist with the indigenous products. Thus, a portion of her teeming millions would take in the imported system and become Buddhists, Mohammedans, or Christians, and all lived side by side in a good neighborly way. But to go back to the introduction of Western civilization during the last half-century. In the matter of clothing, the process of Westernization in the past 30 years has been still more striking. Felt or straw hats have taken the place of old types of headgear. Cut hair has banished the Chinaman's queue, as you have seen it in old pictures. Women wear bobbed hair with permanent waves. Short skirts and silk and nylon stockings have given Chinese women a chance to show their pretty and well-developed legs. As regards their feet, they have indeed gone through a revolution. Western shoes have relieved the age-long agonies of foot binding, with subsequent improvement in their bodily health. Healthy mothers bring forth healthy children. The effect upon the coming generation has been remarkable. Our children are not only healthier as compared with children of days gone by, but more active, quicker in movement, and keener in mind. In social affairs, both sexes intermingle more freely in contrast with the old customs of segregation. In civil law, marriages no longer have to be arranged by parents. Young men and women have the right to find their lovers and choose their own mates. Co-educational institutions are rather the rule than the exception. As regards dwellings, the old superstition of feng shui that affected the choice of sites for buildings has given way to modern theories of architecture. While the old artistic styles are still preserved for their beauty and grandeur in some cases, air, light, convenience, comfort, and hygienic conditions are first considerations. Flush toilets, baths, and a steam heating system are installed in modern houses. Stiff-backed chairs and hard beds have given way to sofas and spring mattresses. Chinese food is rich in its variety because it is always ready to absorb alien elements. Western food is comparatively simple because it is, I think, not so ready to take in foreign materials. Tea was indeed introduced into Europe from China centuries ago. Spices were introduced from the East, and in search for a shorter trade route to India, Columbus happened upon America. Worcestershire sauce, I am told, was developed from Chinese bean sauce. Aside from these, Western food has remained untouched by Eastern influences. Chop suey houses are found by the hundreds in America, and Americans are quite fond of chop suey, but know few other Chinese dishes. On the other hand, China keeps on absorbing more and more alien elements, sometimes sensibly, and at other times rather indiscriminately. Not only food, but clothing, shelter, ideas, social customs, and so forth. In most cases, the process of absorption is through unconscious rather than conscious action. It is something like the absorption of nutriment from the soil by the roots of a tree. They absorb and cannot do otherwise. It is the nature of a growing tree to absorb, or it would cease to grow. The introduction and absorption of alien civilization from China's western frontiers were accomplished in the course of many centuries, during which foreign elements came into the country only in trickles. Therefore, she took them in gradually and slowly digested them. It was for the most part an unconscious process. It did not change the main course of Chinese civilization, but was something like the attraction of a magnet for iron particles. They cluster around it, but the magnet does not change its position. Western civilization, on the other hand, came to China's eastern frontiers by sea in torrents, in all its fierceness, speed, and magnitude, and in the short span of some 50 years. To try to absorb Western civilization, with all that the French and industrial revolutions had contributed to it, was like gobbling up many days' food supply at one meal. Naturally, China suffered some discomfort, not to say unbearable stomach ache. Thus, Western civilization at one time became so distasteful to China that she feared it, cursed, kicked the table over, and turned from it in despair, only to find more food being pressed on her. The reaction against Western civilization was a reaction against food after a stomachache through much overeating. The abortive reforms of 1898 were but a case of overeating. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 was a violent case of acute and complicated indigestion. China was forced on the operating table to be operated on by Western doctors, the allied armies of 8 nations, For that, she had a handsome bill to pay, 450 million taels, and in the operation almost lost her life. The doctrine of Zhang Zhidong that Chinese culture is fundamental and Western civilization is supplementary is no more than to say that a sound stomach is more important to health than the foods it is to take. So China tried to move cautiously, measuring her steps instead of lengthening them. But the tides of Western civilization would not wait for her. They lashed her eastern shores, overflowed into the rich Pearl and Yangtze valleys, and rapidly extended to the Yellow River Valley. She had to go on taking more imported food in spite of her recent serious upset. By 1902, the students who had the best appetites caught up with the spirit of the times and revolution against established authorities, educational, political, and moral as well as intellectual, became the catchword of the rising generation. Burdened with the legacy of the past which seemed to them at the time no more than the dead hand of a bygone civilization, the receptive mind of youth took so enthusiastically to Western ideas as to offset the influences of tradition. Soon after the opening of the 5 treaty ports, China had established arsenals, dockyards, machine shops, schools of foreign languages, had translated books on elementary sciences and sent students to study in America. Being defeated in various wars of self-defense against Western powers, she started to build a navy. A small navy was built, indeed, only to be destroyed by Japan in 1894. Japan could not endure to have China have a navy. Failing this, China went a step further by taking up the reform of government, army, and education. The imperial government at Peking began to prepare for the adoption of a Western constitutional form of government. It established new systems of education, organized modern armies and police, and sent large numbers of students to study abroad. This may be regarded as the first conscious effort in history to absorb a foreign civilization on a large scale, and it had far-reaching consequences in China's national life. The reforms in education were the most important because they were the best planned with most foresight and dealt directly with the rising generation whose minds were least fettered by traditional ideas. Later, when the students of one school generation grew up and came into power, they adopted more Western ways, and consequently those of the succeeding generation were in a better position to absorb more new ideas. When these came to power in their turn, they went still further in Westernization, and more new measures were introduced into the government, army, and schools. Thus, each new generation was more modernized than the previous one. The 1919 student movement in Peking, the emphasis upon science and modern democratic ideas by professors of the National University there, and the literary revolution sponsored by Professor Hu Shi were the beginnings of conscious effort to absorb Western thought, hitherto limited mainly to the industrial and political spheres. This effort came nearer to the heart of Chinese culture, and with it a new leaf was turned in the cultural history of China. For by this means China has been trying to catch up with the advancing tides of the world. Chinese civilization, with compass pointing to the west, has gradually shifted its course to meet the main currents of Western civilization, and in the next 50 years, while still retaining its own characteristics, it will flow in the common channels of the coming civilization of the world. So far, China has already received much benefit from Westernization. the freedom of women to be on equal terms with men in social activities, to marry and remarry, and to have their feet unbound has been gained through the influence of Western respect for women. Western medicine has prevented plagues which wrought yearly havoc among the teeming millions. Painless operations have relieved the suffering of thousands of people. Machinery and inventions have improved means of production and contributed much to the enjoyment of life. And it goes without saying that modern weapons of war have also helped people to kill more and to be killed. Modern science has widened the scope of knowledge. Scientific methods have been carried into the study of Chinese history, philosophy, and literature. Above all, the old superstitions in which people used to live are giving way to the enlightenment of scientific truths. The greater our capacity to absorb Western ideas, the more our civilization will be enriched. Poverty and disease, twin curses of Chinese national life, will gradually disappear in proportion to the extent and thoroughness of China's modernization. To me, in this respect, modernization and westernization seem inseparable if not identical, since the process of modernization began in the West and has gone forward without interruption. So China cannot get one without getting the other. In a way, modernization has been as much imposed upon the West as westernization upon China. Wherever the spearhead of modern invention passes through, it changes the means of production, creates problems of distribution and control, and thus gives rise to new problems. Men must adjust themselves to changing conditions, the constant changes of environment, and adjustments of man to them impose a progress on him. Imagine yourself looking down on Europe after the French Revolution. You would see that there had not been much visible change on the surface of that continent since the Roman Empire. But if you took another look half a century after the Industrial Revolution, the changes would be quite noticeable. After still another half-century, you would find networks of railways covering the surface of all Europe and America too, with trains crawling on them like thousands of centipedes. Here and there, factories with chimneys sticking up would cluster in the large industrial centers like fantastic beehives. Steamboats carrying manufactured goods would be shuttling in and out of harbors, ready to bear the finished products of the factories to all the corners of the earth. These same steamboats half a century ago brought to China the lucifer matches, clocks, kerosene lamps, toys, and other useful and ingenious foreign articles that I played with in childhood in that tranquil village. The innocent and unconscious absorption of these curious things was the beginning of the great change that was to bring China in line with the trend toward modernization, with all its accompanying sufferings, turmoils, and perils, and with the rapid disappearance of the pleasant, tranquil life of old China. Heretofore, the absorption of foreign elements, conscious or unconscious, had enriched the life of the people and led to no complications. With the absorption of modern Western manufactures and systems or ideas, trouble began to spring up. Like the modern sulfa drugs, they cure diseases but sometimes cause serious reactions which may prove fatal. To absorb Western civilization with less violence of reaction is the problem China has yet to face. It calls for experiment and scientific research, which again are Western products. Machine tools to make all modern machinery, mental, social, or industrial.
What you just heard is Tides from the West, a Chinese autobiography, written by Chiang Meng-lin, read by Tang Da-min, and published by the Foreign Language Teaching and Research Press. Some names and terminologies in this book have been updated per contemporary usages.